Great to be here at the Economic Club. Beth, thank you. I admire what you all do. You're in the business of raising the quality of public debate about economic policy choices. Of course, economic outcomes fundamentally are all about what the political system delivers. And the only way to get better economic outcomes over time is to make sure you do what you do, just to make sure people understand the choices, the stakes. You improve the quality of knowledge among elected officials. And again, I admire that noble challenge. Again, a great privilege for me to be here today with your three distinguished congressmen, John Dingell, Sandy Levin, and Hanson Clark. I admire so much what you do. I have a hard job, difficult, messy job, but their job is so much harder, of course, because they need to find ways to work together at a moment when the country is very divided, with very difficult choices ahead, and it's very difficult. For one of our great automobile companies in the town right next to this city for I think 10 years. So my mother grew up here, and that's a sort of nice thing to have in one's history at this moment. And of course, it's great to be here in the city, as Detroit embodies all the challenges and all the promise of this country coming out of this great crisis. But you see here today in Detroit, just a compelling reminder of what the president did make possible at a time of crisis, in not just saving and stabilizing this industry, but help bringing it back stronger than it was before. And today you can say with confidence that the American automobile manufacturers are growing stronger, creating new jobs, manufacturing the fuel-efficient cars and trucks that will carry us forward to a more energy-independent, more competitive future. And for the first time now since 2004, all three have operating profits. And since GM and Chrysler emerged from bankruptcy in June 2009, the industry's added nearly 90,000 jobs, the strongest period of job growth in the auto business in the United States in more than 10 years. Now, of course, our strategy is to make sure these companies emerge stronger and that we put them back fully in private hands as quickly as we can. And today, Chrysler announced that it intends to move to raise the money it needs to repay the government. And 2 years ago, I think it's reasonable to say no one would have expected us to be in the position we are today. And of course, this shows the success of the strategy the president designed and implemented, and the skill and dedication of Chrysler's employees and the workers, the men and women at GM Chrysler and Ford. Of course, we're looking forward to the time when we can, again, fully return these companies to projects that face the American economy, the global economy coming out of this crisis, and they are economic growth, the challenges of economic growth, financial repair and reform, and restoring fiscal sustainability, fiscal responsibility. But first, look, as Ralph did at the beginning of where we were 2 years ago at the beginning of the administration. In early 2009, a conservative free market president had been forced to nationalize Fannie and Freddie, to ask Congress for emergency authority to stem the crisis, had invested $200 billion in banks that represented 85% of our national banking system. The economy was losing 750,000 jobs a month and was shrinking at an annual rate of more than 5%. Auto sales had fallen 40%. Americans have lost $17 trillion in wealth in falling home prices and the value of their pension savings. Businesses were failing across the country, and global trade had slowed sharply. So when the president took office, he had a choice. He could stand aside and hope the fires would burn themselves out. He could debate the options for months, wait for political consensus to emerge, or he could act. And of course, he chose to act. And he chose to take the hard, politically perilous steps to stem the crisis, to clean up the mess he inherited, and to get the economy going again. Of course, that was the right choice, the necessary choice, the most important choice. And because he had the political courage to act then, alongside the support of the Federal Reserve and with the authority provided as a result of brave votes by members of Congress, we're in a much more unsustainable deficits. We now borrow roughly 40 cents of every dollar we spend. There's a foreign policy scholar named Richard Haas, runs the Council on Foreign Relations, who wrote a book called Wars of Choice, Wars of Necessity. This is a war of necessity, not a war of choice. We have no alternative. And I think it's important for Americans to understand that our capacity as a country to finance investments in education, to fund protections for seniors, for the disabled, for the poor, require that we find savings so we can live within our means. And I think Americans need to understand that deficits matter. The deficits are not just the result of spending choices, but also the consequence of an unfair and broken tax code. They need to understand that we can't meet our national security challenges without restoring fiscal sustainability, and that the private sector of this country cannot thrive and prosper without better education outcomes, better public infrastructure, and stronger investments in innovation by the government. Now starting to seep in the basic reality that we have to go back to living within our means as a government, just like the average American family is able to do now. And this challenge in fiscal reform is not just an accounting challenge, it's not a math challenge, it's not just about deciding on the level of reduction deficits you need. The harder challenge, the more difficult challenge, and the thing will determine how we do as a country for the next decades depends on designing reforms that leave us with room to do the essential things and that preserve incentives for economic growth and innovation with a balanced approach that is judged fair by the bulk of the citizens. Lay out a broad strategy for restoring fiscal sustainability. And I want to just conclude by highlighting what I think are going to be the critical elements of a credible, effective strategy. Let me just list these briefly. First, you have to commit to bring the deficit down to a level that will put our overall debt burden on a declining path as a share of the economy. And you have to do that in a reasonable time frame. You have to put it on a path where it's declining by 2015. This requires achieving what economists would call primary surplus. It means achieving a deficit where what you take in revenues is greater than what you spend minus interest. So you have to commit to a target for the deficit. Some people say a deficit cap. Some people say a deficit target or a deficit constraint that starts to put the debt burden on a downward path as a share of the economy. That's the necessary condition for a credible program. Second, you have to bring a comprehensive and balanced approach that achieves savings across all the critical functions of government, from defense through entitlements, and you have to include tax reform. Comprehensive and balanced is important because it allows the burden to be shared, makes the effect on the economy, the impact on the average person, more manageable than if you were to concentrate those cuts on limited parts of the budget, limited functions of government, or on just part of our population. And that's why the President's plan includes $3 in spending cuts. It's really $2 in spending cuts, $1 in interest for every dollar in revenues. The mistake the governments make in financial crises, apart from waiting too long to act initially in the face of the gathering storm, is to put on the brakes too early, to embrace poorly designed, excessively austere fiscal consolidation plans that put at risk the growth you need to repair the damage from a crisis. So you have to lock in these reforms, but over a medium-term path that allows them to be phased in as the economy recovers. Fourth key point, you have to protect investments in things that are critical for future economic growth, again, like education and innovation and infrastructure. These are things we can afford, and we have to afford, or we will be weaker as a country. Growth will be weaker in the future. We'll be less. Our objective, and what we want to work towards, is to take advantage of this moment and try to build a bipartisan consensus. It has to be bipartisan. You can't do this with just one party. And we have a chance to do that now, I think, because if you listen again beneath the rhetoric, you see the leaders of both parties now laying out roughly similar magnitude of cuts, roughly $4 trillion over roughly the same time frame. And we want to take that broad agreement on the magnitude of the change you have to achieve and try to lock that in with as much detail as possible, much detail what we're going to now. This financial crisis caused enormous damage, not just to the economy, not just to the basic economic security of all Americans, but also to confidence in the ability of our system of government to solve problems. And confidence in the economy is going to increasingly depend in the future on our ability to demonstrate again, as we have always in the past, that our political system is up to that challenge, that it works, that it can deliver reforms that are commensurate with the size of our challenges, that we can bring people together even when many things still divide us.
Political conversation in Washington a year and a half ago was almost entirely about recovery still. And very quickly, it seems to have changed almost entirely to discussion about debt. Meanwhile, though, jobs are not coming back nearly at the rate that the administration would hope or had predicted. We've still got like 1.8% GDP growth. Are we talking about the wrong things?
It's absolutely the right question, and I try to make this clear. I think still the overwhelming imperative for us is to make sure we get the economy growing at a sustainable pace. Without that, you're not going to get more people back to work quickly enough, and that's still the fundamental overwhelming challenge. And we're still in the relatively early stage of digging our way out of this and repairing the damage. And of course, any American who's got a friend still out of work, and sells their relative out of work understands that deeply. But because that's so important, you can't ignore forever the broader fiscal challenges we face. And if you don't start to lay out a path for restoring some gravity and balance to our fiscal position, then it will put growth at risk. You'll have no room to do the things necessary to get more people back to work. You won't be able to convince people we can make investments in infrastructure that will help in the short term, not just investments over the long term that will be critical to whether, again, companies around the world will come here to build a factory. So you can't put that off indefinitely. The longer you put it off, the more risk you face that growth will be weakened by a broader loss of confidence in our system. So we're now at the time where it's the right time to try to build that political consensus and begin that process. You don't want to do it prematurely. You don't want to do it precipitously. You want to do it carefully so you're not starving the things that are critical to growth, not weakening the economy. And I think you can do that now. And you'll be better, there'll be more confidence in the economy the quicker we lay out that path for people so they can start to plan for what it's going to mean, for how they're going to adjust. And again, if you don't do that, what you do is leave people with this sense of unease. Because they know our situation is unsustainable. And that unease will produce caution and tentativeness. People will spend less, they'll invest less. And that's why the growth imperative now requires, it's not the only thing it requires, but part of the credible strategy is to begin this process of